Welcome back to Macrocode, and today we are going to learn about SQL Server. So what is SQL Server? SQL Server is a relational database management system developed and marketed by Microsoft. So as a database server, the primary function is actually to store and retrieve data used by different applications. So we have some of you might be wondering what is the difference between SQL and SQL Server. So SQL is a query language, while SQL Server is a database management system. So SQL is a query language for working with a relational database, while SQL is a proprietary software that perform SQL queries. So if you don't have SQL installed, you can actually search on your browser SQL Server, and there is a free version. So SQL Express is a free edition of SQL Server. So you can install it and actually work with it. So it is ideal for development and production for desktop, web, and small applications. So for today's lesson, we are going to learn about how to connect to SQL Server using a tool called SQL Server Management Studio. So if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing and watching our previous videos for more content. So today's video, we are going to learn about how to connect to SQL Server, what is SQL Server Management Studio, and different authentication methods used to connect to server. So SQL Server Management Studio is an integrated environment. Is actually an integrated environment for managing any SQL infrastructure from SQL Server to Azure SQL database. So in short, we usually call SQL Server Management Studio SSMS. So that is a short abbreviation of SQL Server Management Studio. So SSMS provides tools to configure, monitor, and administer instances of SQL Server and database. So use SSMS to deploy, monitor, and upgrade the data tier components used by your applications and build queries and event scripts. So you can actually download SSMS. So if you go to your browser and just search SQL Management Studio, you'll be able to see this is the link. So as I've said, SQL Server Management Studio is a software developed by Microsoft that is used for configuring, managing, and administering all components with Microsoft SQL Server. So if you open this, you can actually download. It is a free version. Currently, it is 18.12. So you can download the latest general availability version that then you can install it to your machine. So we'll be looking on how we can connect this to our SQL server. So when connecting to SQL Server, you open SQL Server Management Studio. So I've launched mine. So if you open SQL Server Management Studio, this is the first screen that you'll be able to see after installation. So the first thing is you need to have the address of the server. So some of you might be asking, why do we need SSMS? So SSMS is just a client tool to connect to SQL Server, and it is not the actual SQL Server. It is not a relational database. So it is just a tool to connect to SQL Server. So most of the developers use SSMS to connect to a single server. So if I just highlight this, so you can see on my screen we have the database server, which is our SQL server. Then we have the developer machine 1, developer machine 3, developer machine 4, and developer machine 2. So if you want different developers to access this single database instance, then they will use SSMS to connect to these database, and they can be connecting from their local machines. So developer machines or clients connect to the SQL server using SQL Server Management Studio. So they can connect differently from their local machine to a single SQL server. and actually create tables, databases, and manipulate things in our SQL server. So we will be looking on how to do that. So if you open your SQL server, this is what you will be able to see. So we have the server type. So the server type automatically by default it will connect to database engine. But if you drop it, we see we have the server type as analysis services. So this one is the SS. So that is SQL Server Analysis Services. We have SSRS. So this is the SQL Server Reporting Services. Then we have the SSIS. This is the SQL Server Integration Services. So these are the the server types that we'll be able to see. So these will be connecting to analysis services. If we point this to it, we will be connecting to reporting services and the integration services. But if you want to connect to databases, then this is the database engine that you need to provide. Then the server name. So assuming you have installed your SQL server in your server, and you can only reach your server through an IP address, then you will need to provide an IP address for you to connect to your server here. So if that is your IP address, then you need to provide it. But for my case, I've installed this to my machine. So you'll see I have the machine name. So this is my machine name and the instance. So if I also want to connect to our local host, you can also use local to connect to a local machine. Then you can also use a full column to connect to your server. So you just provide the server name. So this one refers to will connect locally, and even this one will connect locally, and even if you provide our local IP address, which is that, then you will be able to connect it to your server. So on authentication methods, when installing SQL Server, it always prompts you to choose the authentication type. One of the authentication type is the mixed mode and the SA authentication. So if you choose mixed mode, you can be able to access your SQL Server through Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. But if you choose Windows authentication, then you'll be able to use Windows authentication. So the Windows authentication uses your Windows account to log into your SQL Server. As long as you are logged into your machine, then you can automatically log into your SQL Server. Then the authentication that you will use is the Windows authentication. So for this one, you don't provide any username and password. But if you choose SQL Server authentication, then it will prompt you to provide the username, the login account, that is username, and the password for you to access it. So if I just choose Windows authentication, I'll be able to connect to my SQL server. So the server connection, SQL server connection, you will need to choose database engine. Then you'll need to choose the server name. Either you provide it if it's local or an IP address of the server that you want to connect. Then the Windows authentication, on the authentication, you can use either the Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. So for the SQL Server authentication, you will need to pass the username and password, SA account and password. So if you have that, these are the credentials that you configure while installing your SQL Server. So that is it for authentication. So if we just proceed and connect to our SQL Server, if I just say connect, so it will connect to our SQL Server that is already locally installed. But if you have a SQL Server that is installed in the server, then you provide the server name will be your IP address with the port to the SQL Server. Let me just use my that. Yes, so it is already connected. So you can see my server address here. Then we have the databases. So currently I have these 3 databases, and we have what we call the system databases. So these system databases are usually installed by default when installing SQL Server. So they're actually needed by SQL Server to work. So these are the default database that when you install your SQL Server, you'll be able to find it. So on our next video, we'll be looking on how to create databases and even creating tables and manipulating data. So if you want to create a new query, assuming you want to perform or create a database, so you can see we have another icon here called new query. So if you click this is where you are able to now start executing your SQL queries. And always you'll need to check the database that you are actually operating on when executing SQL queries. So if we want to create a database, which we'll do on our next video, we use a command called create database. Then you provide the name of the database. So you can create a database called college. So if you say create database college, then you execute at the top. You'll see that our command has executed successfully. And if you refresh the database, you'll see there is a college database. That is another one way of creating a database. Another way is you right click at the database folder, then you say new database, then it will prompt you with the database name. If you don't want to create using query, then you can say college 2. So if you just click OK, we'll have our database already created. So that is how you create database after connecting to SQL Server Management Studio. So subscribe to our channel and remember to share and like our videos. On our next video, we'll be looking on how to create tables and even views and stored procedures. So subscribe and thank you for watching.